Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. It's been a little while since I have recorded something between just not quite feeling up to par and having a few computer issues, more the former than the latter, but those together constitute my excuses for not having recorded earlier. Partially the impetus for me finally getting move on and getting something up is I am starting to see in the Historathon Discord people uh, people posting their mid-quarter wrap-up. Mid-quarter? Yeah. Uh, Mid-quarter wrap-up for the first quarter of the Historathon. And I was like, oh yeah, I probably should do something like that at some point. I'm using my Kings and Queens of England little mug that is a uh, unemployed unemployed philosopher guild mug. A tongue-in-cheek gift from my dad, which he didn't think I actually used. Anyway, I haven't watched any of the other videos, so I am just going to sort of wing it. I haven't been really getting much in the way of any videos watched that are booktube videos in spite of my best intentions. Watched a few here and there, but my fatigue's been really bad and I've been wanting to use my time when I am awake to read. So reading has taken up my booktube watching time. Just want to move some of these things where I can get them without knocking everything over. I mean, I probably still will knock everything over, but I guess I'll cover stash enhancements first, even though this really isn't related to my mid-quarter wrap-up. I had this on back order from Thrift Books, and it did come in. This is Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years by Elizabeth Wayland Barber. So I am looking forward to reading this. It looks good. Then the other one that just came in is Tacitus, The Histories, which I might not get this in this time around for a Historathon, but I do plan on reading this eventually. Because I've been reading so much Roman history, what did I do with it? Oh, part of me wants to put Herodotus on hold and go ahead and onto Tacitus, but I started Herodotus first, and he did write his first, so I probably will go ahead and finish Herodotus before I start Tacitus. And I do have on Kindle Suetonius. Suetonius? Not quite sure how that's pronounced. Anyway, I do have the 12 Caesars by him, so I'll probably read him after I read Tacitus. So, much future plans. I'd be surprised if I finish Herodotus this time around. I mean, y'all, the text is so small. I am going to touch on this one briefly. I was surprised at how I'd started this as primarily a religious book, but I did find as I was reading it that it covers a lot of Jewish culture during that time period, and also some of the history leading up to that time period that gives you a sort of cultural perspective of what it would have been like to be a Jew during Jesus' time. So I am counting Jesus the Way, the Truth, and the Life as part of the Historathon, because actually throughout, it talks about Jewish beliefs and Jewish cultural practices that give you really the backdrop of what's going in the Bible and gives a better idea of what it is like to live in Judea during that time period. Which, honestly, reading this plus having been reading things about that deal with Tiberius. Herod comes up first with Caligula, and then later, a little bit at least, with Claudius. So these different figures, actually, Pontius Pilate, I believe, runs afoul. I want to say it's Caligula and not Nero that he runs afoul with. So you see these people who show up in the biblical text as I'm also simultaneously reading Roman history. It's interesting to see the two perspectives. So I'm enjoying this. I also have set aside, I have to see where Josephus, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Josephus, the Jewish historian, during, I think he was during Vespasian's time period. I could be wrong about that though. I think he would be after Suetonius, because I do have his books. His book? I think he has several books, several works. So I tend to read him after I do Suetonius. So I do have a nice little collection of ancient historians to read through. I'm going to pull up because I've done quite a bit of reading since the beginning of the Historathon, so I need to pull up my story graph, because this has been on the fly, and I have a mixture of audiobooks, Kindle books, and then physical books that I've been reading, so keeping track of everything, it's just easier for me to pull up my story graph, because that's where I have the challenge for the Historathon. Okay, there we go. So things that I have already finished this quarter, I think the first one I finished was Boudica, and I mentioned that earlier. That was an audiobook, and what I enjoyed about that one was the different points of view of both Tacitus, and I think the other one was Dido, although I can't remember, how their different perspectives and their different tellings of the same story showed their biases and how they viewed Roman society, because by placing their views or their values on the story that they were telling. So for Tacitus, for example, Boudica was shown to be the noble warrior, almost as a foil to I think it was Nero who was at the time period, the almost effeminate in the view of Tacitus, Nero. So the comparison of the warrior queen to Nero, it was intended to be a judgment on the emperor. And I believe Tacitus also wanted things to return to more of a republic. So his view of Nero, his view of the degradation of the empire, affected how he viewed Boudica and the Britons. So I found that to be actually probably the most interesting aspect of the Boudica audiobook biography, because I mean there's not a whole ton about Boudica, as in there's nothing in the way of stuff that her people would produce, because I don't think that they had any writing that if they had any sort of writing, it didn't pass down to us. I got the impression that most of their communication was oral, but I could be wrong. One of my goals is to eventually read more on Roman Britannia, because I find that an interesting topic. Let's see, after Boudica, I finished Caligula. And my problem with that book is that even though I found it to be interesting, because it gave me another point of view on Caligula, gave some possible reasons behind some of his insane behavior, I did not appreciate the author's decision to bring modern examples and to put modern views and biases upon his history. So that book didn't rate particularly highly for me. Now, after that, I've had actually a really good experience. I don't have it here anymore, but I already showed it before. I finished Bob Brier's The Murder of Tutankhamun. Now, what's been interesting, and I'm going to bring in something I'm reading right now, after I finished that, and I had done a whole video about my personal theory based off of what Bob Brier, whatever, wrote. I also happen to have two other of his books, 2 or 3 others. Egyptomania, I think something about living as a common person in Egypt, and then one more recent that he wrote like last year or the year before on an update on Tutankhamun. So I have not read the most recent update on Tutankhamun. From what I understand, he walks back some things he mentions in the book I read, which, I mean, I wish I had known the other book existed before formulating my theory, but I did not. Well, theories are made to be tested and disproven. That's the whole point of both science and history, actually. You're supposed to disprove your theories, and if you don't disprove them, then that's a little bit closer to the truth. But after I finished The Murder of Tutankhamun, I started Egypt's Golden Couple, when Akhenaten and Nefertiti, I need to drink a tea, were gods on earth. I am not sure what I think about this. The style is different. Each chapter starts with kind of what I would call like a storytelling aspect, so it's an imaginative section. Now, he pulls it's a husband-wife team, I believe. They pull their section at the beginning, which is narrative, from different images, different sources. I think a lot of them are images or descriptions from actual ancient artifacts, and they use that to build a narrative that's just some storytelling before they get into the meat and potatoes of things. I'm not sure how I feel about that format. I find it a little bit jarring to go between the imagination of what the author's choosing to imagine and then to what facts are available. Now, I did enjoy the part where they talked about how images were placed upon funerary walls or things like that. How they use what my dad, who is a painter, what he uses, which is the graph system. So they'll have papyrus in their case, in my dad's case, an art pad where you draw your initial picture that you want to have on either, in Dad's case, a canvas, or in the case of the ancient Egyptians, a tomb wall. And then on the smaller picture, they will have a grid system worked out. Okay, here's grid 1, 2. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. And they have all the squares and say, like, okay, a staff is usually 2 squares. It's the same thing, actually, I do when I design color work for knitting. You have the squares, and then you know, okay, there's so many squares for this. And they would then they would have the squares on their papyrus or whatever, and then on the walls it would get, from what I gathered, they got like string or rope or something, and then with some white powder, pull it back, and then let it hit against the wall, and they created their grids that way. And then they would do the grid system of transferring the works. So it still works today. My dad uses it all the time when he is transferring something that he initially draws that maybe he doesn't want to just originally visage upon the canvas first. So I thought that was interesting. And from what they were telling in the book, their are still some of these markings in place, which is why they know that this was a system that they used. So I found that was interesting. What I do find, though, and something I don't necessarily like about this book, is I feel like this author makes some assumptions without necessarily supporting his opinions. And I wrote in the book in areas that I noted this. And I say he, but when it was really what I think is a husband-wife team. Let's see. So, like, there's a point here where these authors are making the case that the manifestation, the artistic manifestation of Akhenaten and Nefertiti to have the misshapen heads and the oddly shaped bodies, that this was purely an artistic representation. It didn't have anything to do with reality. This was just an artistic style. Now, I can see on the one hand where a case could be made for that possibly, but I remember in the last book I read, the one about the murder of Tutankhamun, there actually was the skull of Tutankhamun. You saw the misshapen head. You saw, and it wasn't like misshapen like in the way that like it had been smashed or something. It had that lengthened head that you do see with something like a Marfan syndrome. So I'm not sure how this author has not explained away some of that. Now, granted, we are dealing with Tutankhamun's parents. The problem is that this author uses absolutes. There's indisputable evidence, and this is a quote, "The artistic transformations of Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III are indisputable evidence that Akhenaten and Nefertiti's physical metamorphoses were not the result of pathology." And I take issue with indisputable. I didn't feel like this author did a sufficient job supporting his thesis to make it indisputable. So that part kind of bothered me. There's a lot of interesting things in here, but between the stylistic shifting back and forth between storytelling, the author's own imagination, and then going onto evidence after they're done, with their little imaginative section. That style I find confusing, and then their tendency to make sweeping statements with not enough to support it. So yeah, after I read this one, I have earmarked a book by an author. I just finished reading a book by that I thoroughly enjoyed. Actually, I read 2 books by this author this time period, this quarter thus far. And if I can get through this book before the end of the quarter, I want to read another of the author's books. So the author's name is, I need to pull up the book so I can see the name, Guy de la Bedouillere. I'm not pronouncing that right. The first book that I read was Domina, and that was about the women of I think it was the Julii and, the Claudian women, and then the ones, mostly the Claudian women. They did Julio-Claudian women, but did deal with some of the later imperial women of Rome, but mostly the Julio-Claudii. And the other book by that author that I finished reading, just finished it, where'd it go? So it is called Praetorian, by the same author, Guy de Bedouillere. Yeah. French name that I can't pronounce. The Rise and Fall of Rome's Imperial Bodyguard. That is very interesting. And I'm appreciating the fact that this author is very objective. He isn't really putting his own opinions on anything. Or at least not, if he has opinions, I don't feel like he's forcing them upon me. I enjoy Domina, I'm enjoying the Praetorian, and after I finish this book, he has a book about Akhenaten that is available through one of my library apps. So I really want to make it through this one so I can read Guy's book on Akhenaten. I have a feeling that between this book, which I don't like as much, the one on Tutankhamun that I read by Bob Breyer, however, and then if I can then pull in the other book by Guy, I'll get a bit of a, I'll have all these different cameras from different points of view, and I'll be able to start forming my own opinion a bit more. Because prior to this, I think most of my point of view about Akhenaten really has come from Dr. Breer. I'm not terribly fond about how the Darnell couple are handling this. But, I mean, Dr. Breer also had his definite bias as well. So I'm going from one very biased author to another very biased author. I just preferred the way that Dr. Breer wrote. And Dr. Breer felt a little bit, he didn't use words like indisputable. That really bothers me for whatever reason. So yes, there's that one. For other books I've finished, I'm going to mention next the one I actually finished last, which is Antony and Cleopatra. This was another free book through Audible. Audible has a lot of, if you have a membership, Audible has actually quite a few books that you don't even have to use a credit for. You can just listen to. So I took advantage of that to listen to Antony and Cleopatra by Adrian Goldsworthy. I like him. I like any author who right from the go says, hey, I might be upsetting your views of Cleopatra. I am just going to tell you what the evidence presents, and it might not, fit to your particular idea, either through more modern views where she's maybe presented more as a feminist heroine, or views of antiquity where she was seen more as a seductress, or some views where she might be seen more as a patriot. He's like, I'm not going to be trying to form Cleopatra to any of these views. I'm going to take what evidence exists at the time, try to compare all the different sources, and then present you with how Cleopatra was to the best of what we can tell. And what I like about the way that this author, Adrian Goldsworthy, writes is he doesn't mind saying, we can't know that. We just don't have the evidence for this. This could be it, or that could be it, but honestly, there's just not enough evidence. And when you're dealing with ancient sources, I mean, that's gonna be the case. So I really enjoyed that book. Actually, I gave that one 5 stars. And immediately after, I listened to his audiobook on Hadrian's Wall. I mean, that one was good too. It was a little bit more dry, but that's just because there was a lot more to deal with, like what things looked like and about where things were located, about numbers of soldiers. And I tend to be someone who I'm very much character focused. And if you start giving me too much description, I just have trouble picturing it. So it wasn't the author's fault. It's a limitation that I've always had when reading. I have to work extra hard when I'm reading anything. This comes up when I read fantasy, which tends to be more descriptive than a lot of the other things that I read. Or when I read sci-fi, tends to be a little bit more descriptive too. Is I will find myself skimming descriptions of the environment, of the surroundings. I just want to get right to the meat of it, which is the characters. So because Hadrian's Wall had a lot to do with what's going on around with the scene that had to be set. For me, it wasn't a book I could get as much into. Now, when he dealt with the people, oh yeah, I was right there for it. I was really enjoying it. Even when he was talking about how the different guards might have been pulled away during different periods because of different political situations through the empire. Again, that was something that I could get my teeth more into. But when he was dealing with the description of the wall and the description of the communities that were there, then I started having trouble focusing. Not so much a fault of the author, just a problem with me as a reader. And it doesn't matter if I'm listening to audiobook or if I'm reading a book. It's just a limitation that I have to work through as a reader. So I read that one after Antony and Cleopatra. I mentioned prior to this that I had listened to a book on Nero, which I enjoyed. That one was good. I really liked Antony and Cleopatra. Hadrian's Wall was good. I just finished, I can't remember what I rated it. I'm pretty sure I rated it a 5. If I didn't, it was pretty close. I just finished Germanicus by Lindsay Powell. And this is another author that I will be reading more of in the future. Actually, I've already started my next book by this author. Lindsay Powell wrote Germanicus, and I was really wanting to read Germanicus. I had started getting an idea of being interested when I was reading, or rather listening to the book on Caligula. Now, that author, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, that author gave a very biased view. To be fair, that author used Tacitus primarily as a source. So he very much leaned on Tacitus's view of Tiberius and the Tiberius-Germanicus relationship. What I like about Lindsay Powell, just like Adrian Goldsworthy, at the front of the book, he's like, hey, I am going to go off what the evidence is. This might disrupt certain views of different people who are mentioned in this book, but this is supposed to be the most accurate representation of these people based on the sources that we have. And Lindsay Powell, just like Adrian Goldsworthy, did a really good job, I felt, being, I'm sorry, my brain, I'll tell you what, guys, of not being biased, of being unbiased, that's what I was looking for. One of the things, as much as I enjoyed learning about Germanicus, I already knew going in I was going to like Germanicus. Germanicus, even though he definitely had things that Lindsay Powell mentioned in the book that showed, like, yeah, he was a product of his time period. But based off of the evidence around Germanicus, he did seem to live up to the hype around him. He did seem to be a good family man, a loyal Roman, a good leader whose life ended way too soon, whether you believe it was by poisoning or from getting sick from being in the area of the world around Syria. I haven't quite made up my mind about that. It is interesting that Tacitus didn't seem like he made up his mind, and Tacitus was the first one to point the finger at Tiberius. He was very anti-Tiberius, anti-Livia, pro-Germanicus, pro-Agrippina the Elder. So that does make me pause that Tacitus didn't believe that. I'm inclined to... I want to believe that the thoroughly unlikable Piso was as guilty as his behavior seemed to indicate. But I can see equally how it really could have been just very, unfortunately, very poor behavior under some very trying circumstances. He could have he could have just held in his dislike a little bit better when such a popular member of the imperial family died. It just seemed like he might have been an unlikable person, but it doesn't necessarily mean he was a poisoner. And I do appreciate that part, that Tacitus didn't seem inclined to push that narrative in spite of the fact that he didn't like Tiberius. And he still didn't choose to push the narrative that Tiberius encouraged Piso to have Germanicus killed. The one thing I liked about Lindsay Powell's book on Germanicus, is it's the first book that I've read that's actually let me see another side of Tiberius. Everything I've ever read that's had any mention of Tiberius has only mentioned his worst aspects. You know, he was degenerate in certain areas when it came to young boys and just other perversions, and talking about his vicious attacks, particularly on Germanicus's family after Germanicus passed. Just his paranoia after Germanicus passed. All these things. This was the Tiberius that I was familiar with. And this was the Tiberius that the book on Caligula only showed me. And that's, if you read Tacitus, that's the only Tiberius that ever existed. That Tiberius was the Tiberius throughout his life. What I thought was interesting was Lindsay Powell tried to look at Tiberius from as unjudgmental a view as possible, taking into account, not judging him immediately as just being malevolent and horrible and all those other things, just going like, okay, he was this great warrior, which I didn't know. I mean, I just always think of this guy hiding away on his island, almost sulky and, annoyed at his mother and irritated that he has to have this role that he didn't necessarily want, irritated that he was forced to divorce his first wife, who I gathered that he was actually quite fond of. Forced to marry Julia, who he did not love, and all these other things. Those were the aspects of Tiberius that I knew, and this other Tiberius, the Tiberius who was the warrior, the Tiberius who tried his best until Germanicus died to follow what Augustus's desires were, what Augustus' will seemed to set out for him. Augustus wanted him to adopt Germanicus and to promote Germanicus as the next one in line after Tiberius. And it seems from everything that was presented by Powell that Tiberius did do those things, even to the detriment of his own son, Drusus the Younger. I think it would be Drusus the Younger, because his brother was Drusus, because Tiberius' brother was Drusus the Elder. But I thought, I thought it was interesting. That was not something that was mentioned in the other sources that I read. As much as I learned about Germanicus, I thoroughly enjoyed learning about Tiberius. And if I say there's anything I took away from this book, it was that, a more nuanced view of Tiberius, as well as what I expected to get out of it, which was a continued appreciation of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. So just for the more nuanced view of Tiberius, even if it was just for that, this book got a huge 5-star review from me. So I have several. I think I actually have all of Lindsay Powell's books that I had on my wish list, on my to-read list. I haven't started any of them yet because I have too many books going at once right now. I did, however, start one that is not related to ancient Rome. which is, I want to bring up the cover. So this is Care in the Past, Archaeological and Interdisciplinary Perspectives, edited by Lindsay Powell, William Southwell Wright, and Rebecca Gowland. So the fact that Lindsay Powell's name is on this was enough to be like, okay, this is going to be good, because I know Lindsay Powell, based on his other work, he's going to be as unbiased as possible. And this is a topic that I'm already interested in. This is about caregiving. So the preface is by Charlotte Roberts, who was it sounds like she was a nurse, and then she ended up becoming a bioarchaeologist, which I find is fascinating. For anyone who has not watched my channel before, I actually was a nurse before I ended up becoming disabled, which is part of why topics such as disability or healthcare, caregiving in history, these are interesting things to me. Not only from the point of view of someone who is disabled, but also from the point of view of someone who has been a healthcare professional. So I thought it was interesting that the person who did the preface was a healthcare professional before choosing to become an archaeologist. I'm only at the very beginning. I'm about 12% through, and I'm not very far along. I have finished the preface. I'm now in the introduction, but this looks to be good. It's a collection of several different papers. There it is. They're talking about dealing with how children were cared for during a time period. They want to talk about how elderly, how disabled, and actually even giving care to animals. So all sorts of aspects of caregiving in the ancient world. So I think this is going to be very interesting. It's not a very long book. It's not even 300 pages. So I'm hoping that I can make my way through it pretty quickly. If you're not necessarily interested in reading a collection of scholarly articles, this might not be the book for you. It is that, because that's exactly what it is. It's a collection of scholarly articles that's pieced together in a book. So it's not written in the style of popular historians or anything like that. This is a work for archaeologists, scholars. They're not aiming for the general audience. It is a bit of not hard going, but it requires focus. I can't read this when I'm tired. Just like, well, segue, I can't necessarily read this book when I'm tired, although at least the sections are shorter in this one. This is The Eye of the Beholder, and I'm slowly but surely working my way through this. Eye of the Beholder, Deformity and Disability in the Greco-Roman World, and it's by Robert Garland. And I thought reading the book on caregivers in antiquity while reading a book on deformity and disability in antiquity would work very well together. I have been enjoying this. I am very appreciative of the fact that there's these little sections. So, like, sins of the parents in this chapter on the Formed and the Divine, that is a little over about 2 pages for that little subset in the chapter. Actually, it looks like that's usually 2, no more than 3 pages per each little subset in the chapter, which is nice. If I don't have a lot of time to read, as long as I can focus enough, I can get a little bit of this book read. Because I definitely want to finish reading this book before the next quarter starts. Let me look at my... I think I've shown just about everything. I mentioned all those. Let me look at my currently reading. I think I showed all of it, though. Yeah, I think that's everything. So yeah, this has been a bit rambly. I'm sorry for that. I haven't recorded for a while. I'm not having the greatest time focusing, so I know it's all over the place. But yeah, if you find any of these books sounding interesting to you, I would recommend them, particularly anything by Lindsay Powell or Adrian Goldsworthy. After I finish the book on the Praetorian Guard by Guy de la Belliger, am I even going to try that? By Guy. I haven't decided whether I'm going to go on to read Philip and Alexander, another Adrian Goldsworthy book. Oh, never mind. If I already have set aside for March Mystery Madness, Monsters and Monarchs by Debbie Felton. So I'm going to read that information for you. So, serial killers in classical myth and history. So when I saw this, and I believe this is a 9-hour, 4-minute long audiobook. So, summary. Jack the Ripper, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Locusta of Gaul. If that last name doesn't seem to fit with the others, it's likely because our modern society largely believes that serial killers are a recent phenomenon. Not so, argues Debbie Felton. Okay, that needed a space in there. Argues Debbie Felton. In fact, there's ample evidence to show that serial killers stalked the ancient world just as they do the modern one. Which makes sense, human nature doesn't change. Felton brings this evidence to light in Monsters and Monarchs, and in doing so forces us to rethink the assumption that serial killers arise from problems unique to modern society. Exploring a trove of stories from classical antiquity, she uncovers mythological monsters and human criminals that fit many serial killer profiles. The highway killers confronted by the Greek hero Theseus, such as Procrustes, who tortured and mutilated their victims, the Sphinx, or Strangler from the story of Oedipus, child-killing demons and witches, which could explain abnormal infant deaths, and historical figures such as Locusta of Gaul, the most notorious poisoner in the early Roman Empire. I wonder if they're going to bring up there's another poisoner that was mentioned in the Germanicus case, but she ended up dying, presumably of poison, before she could be brought to trial. She was thought to have provided poison to Piso's wife. Or that's what a lot of people believed. Redefining our understandings of serial killers and their origins, Monsters and Monarchs changes how we view both ancient Greek and Roman society and the modern-day killers whose stories still captivate the public today. So yes, that is my next audiobook, because by the time I'm finished the Praetorian, I should be ready for Monsters and Monarchs. I also have set aside a couple of other books, let's see, with March Mystery Madness in mind. My Kindles, there we go. So there is Killing Aristophanes, a true crime story from ancient Athens. And there is I thought I picked that up. I don't see it on there. I thought there was something about the murder trials. It was like Cicero or something. Could be wrong about that. Well, I can't find it now, but I could have sworn there was something about... Okay, I have to find it again, because someone mentioned it in a chat I was in, and I thought I had picked it up, but maybe I didn't. It was about some trials in antiquity that dealt with murder and all these other kind of things, and I thought I picked it up, but I don't see it here. Which means I probably didn't. Okay, but anyway, I at least have Killing Aristophanes and the book on serial killers in antiquity. So, yeah, those are my planned books for March Mystery Madness that will also fit in to the Historathon. Of course, I have to finish some other things. I'm going to try not to add too many other things on without first dropping another book, because I can't keep adding books. I won't finish them before this quarter ends. I think that I've probably rambled on for long enough. Thank you very much if you've managed to last through to the end of this. I will try to record more frequently so that way I'm not quite so all over the place when I record next time. But yeah, thank you very much. I will see you whenever I next see you. God bless. Bye.